Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Our text this morning are the verses 8 to 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, you can also find this on page 964 and 965 in the church Bibles. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning at verse 8, we read this. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hope that He will deliver us again. You also must help us by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessings granted us through the prayers of many. Let's open with a word of prayer. Father, I ask that as we look into this passage this morning, that you would remind us of your great strength. And Father, that you would help us to turn to you even in the most difficult of circumstances. Lord, that our focus would be and our dependence would be on you. I pray that you would bless the reading of your word this morning, and I pray that you would help us to apply it and understand it. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, in the mid-1800s, there was a Presbyterian minister named John Paton. No relation to George Patton, the general that we know from World War II. John Paton was someone who went to share the gospel with cannibals who were living on the island of Tanna in the South Pacific. And while he lived there, his life was constantly in danger. And the natives were almost daily looking for ways to kill him and eat him. They were cannibals after all. In his riveting biography, where he tells his own story, he tells the story of one such instance where his life came under a threat from a hostile local chieftain whose name was Miyaki. Now, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to read to you a portion of this story. Now, we're picking it up in the middle of what's going on, and what you need to know is that Miyaki had threatened to come the next day to attack the mission house and to kill the missionaries. And so what the missionaries were doing, they ran back to their home to try to gather what they could, and they're about to flee for their lives. So we're going to pick it up at that point, and I want you to hear what was taking place. He said, I sent Abraham, this is one of his co-workers, to consult Nowar, who's a friendly chieftain, who had defended us till disabled by a spear in the right knee. He sent a canoe by Abraham, advising me to take some of my goods in it to his house by night, and he would try to protect them and us. The risk was so great, we could only take very little. Enemies were on every hand to cut off our flight, and Miyaki, the worst of all, whose village had to be passed in going to Nowar's. In the darkness of the mission house, we durst not light a candle for fear of someone seeing us and shooting us. Not one of Nowar's men durst come to help us, but in the end it made no difference, for Nowar and his men kept what was taken there as their portion of the plunder. Abraham, his wife, and I waited anxiously for the morning light. It says, Miyaki, the false and the cruel, came to assure us that the heathen would not return that day. Yet as daylight came in, Miyaki himself stood and blew a great conch shell not far from our house. I ran out to see why this trumpet shell had been blown, and what I found was the signal for a great company of howling armed savages to rush down the hill on the other side of the bay and make straight for the mission house. We had not a moment to lose. To have remained would have been certain death to us all, and also to Matthew, a teacher just arrived from Mr. Matheson's station. I held on while one gleam of hope remained. Escape for life was now the only path of duty. I called the teachers, locked the door, and made quickly for Noar's village. There was not a moment left to carry anything with us. In the issue, Abraham, his wife, and I lost all our earthly goods and all our clothing except what we had on. My Bible, the few translations which I had made into Tanese, and a light pair of blankets I carried with me. It says we could not take the usual path along the beach, for there were our enemies would have quickly overtaken us. We entered the bush in the hope of getting away unobserved, but a cousin of Miyaki, evidently secreted to watch us, sprang from behind a breadfruit tree and swinging his tomahawk aimed it at my brow with a fiendish look. Avoiding it, I turned upon him and said in a firm voice, "If you dare to strike me, my Jehovah God will punish you. He is here to defend me now." The man trembling looked all around as if to see the God who was my defender, and the tomahawk gradually lowered at his side. With my eye fixed upon him, I gradually moved backwards in the track of the teachers, and God mercifully restrained him from following me. On reaching Noar's village unobserved, we found the people terror-stricken, crying, rushing about in despair at such a host of armed savages approaching. I urged them to ply their axes, cut down trees, and blockade the path. For a little while they wrought vigorously at this, but when, so far as I could reach, they saw the shore covered with armed men rushing on toward their village, they were overwhelmed with fear. They threw away their axes and weapons of war. They cast themselves headlong on the ground, and they knocked themselves against the trees as if to court death before it came. They cried, "Missy," that's the missionary, "it's of no use. We will all be killed and eaten today. See what a host are coming against us." Mothers snatched up little children and ran to hide in the bush. Others waded as far as they could into the sea with them, holding their heads above the water. The whole village collapsed in a condition of indescribable terror. Noar, laying with his wounded knee, got a canoe turned upside down and sat upon it where he could see the whole approaching multitude. He said, "Missy, sit down beside me and pray to our Jehovah God. For if he does not send deliverance now, we are all dead men. They will kill us all on your account, and that quickly. Pray, and I will watch." You ever had your back against the wall? John Patton had his back against the wall that day as he sat on that canoe next to that Tanese chieftain as they watched a whole army of men approach to kill them. This type of situation, though, is not the first one that has ever been encountered by a Christian missionary. In fact, our passage this morning is a similar account. It tells us the story of the Apostle Paul as he recounts a time where he, like John Patton, faced what seemed to him to be certain death. Paul, on that day, as he contemplated where it looked like there was no escape, all hope seemed lost. Paul was helpless, and if he was going to make it, he was going to have to find strength in someone other than himself. I would like, as we look at our passage this morning, to consider three aspects of it. We're looking at a passage that I think will speak to Paul's desperate situation. We'll say a little more about that in a moment. We will also see Paul's dependence on God in this circumstance. And then finally, we will see God's great deliverance of Paul from this deadly peril. So let's look first of all at Paul's desperate situation. Now I need to say up front, there's only so much I'm going to be able to do to reconstruct the circumstances. There are some things that we know for certain. There are some things that we have a pretty good guess at, but there's other details we simply do not know. me do my best to paint the picture of Paul's desperate situation. We read about this in verses 8 and 9, where it says, "For we did not want you to be unaware, my brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia." So what do we know about this passage, or what can we say about it? Well, if we consider, I think, first of all, the one certain thing that we can talk about is the location where the affliction took place. We know, if you notice the verse there, the affliction was experienced in Asia. Now, this is a reference to Asia Minor. This is modern-day Turkey. But that's all we know. Was it in Ephesus? Was it in Colossae? Was it in Troas? We simply do not know. All we know is that this affliction took place in Asia. What we would want to ask then, well, what is the nature of this affliction? Can we say anything about that? We can have what I would say is a reasonable guess as to what it involved. All he does is say there that, if you notice verse 8 again, he just simply says, the affliction. Notice it is singular. The affliction. So he seems to have a specific instance in mind, but what was it? The Corinthians would have known what it was, and if they had any questions about it, they could have just asked Timothy, who was bringing them 2 Corinthians, and they said, well, what affliction is this, Timothy? And he would have told them. The best we can do is guess. There are two major possibilities as to what he's referring to. Some scholars have believed that he has in mind a severe illness that may well have brought him to the brink of death. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, Paul does describe a thorn in the flesh that he seemingly could not overcome. Some have believed and thought that that was some kind of a physical ailment. So it's possible that that's what it was. However, there are good reasons for thinking that is not the proper understanding of the word. For one thing, the word affliction that is used here by Paul is normally in Paul's writings associated with persecutions and ministry trials. It is not a term that he typically will use when he's talking about a physical problem. So this suggests that it is probably not an illness. We should note as well that Paul uses, when he's describing this, not the singular pronoun for himself, I. He's saying we. You notice the language that, for we did not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. Now, if Paul is talking about his own personal illness, isn't it strange that he would use the plural here? It seems likely that he's including other Christians in this affliction. So this is more than, it seems, to be some personal matter for Paul. Finally, the reason that persuades me mostly against this idea that he's talking about an illness is the fact that Paul, in verse 5 of this chapter, described his sufferings as being, they were sharing in the sufferings of Christ, or Christ's sufferings. It is difficult to see how a personal illness falls under the category of Christ's sufferings. So far as we know, while we do see instances in the Gospels where where Jesus is tired, and of course we know the physical torment that he underwent on the cross, we don't have examples of Jesus suffering from severe illnesses. And so it seems unlikely that Paul would have included that in his description here. The second option, so if we dismiss the notion of a severe illness, while we can't rule it out entirely, it seems unlikely. The better way, I think, to understand what Paul is getting at when he's describing this affliction is he's talking about some trial that was associated with ministry opposition. With ministry opposition. Paul, it would be almost impossible to determine which one it is specifically. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul lists out a huge number of them. So which one specifically does he have in mind? I don't know. But listen to this list of afflictions that Paul experienced while doing the work of the ministry. Verse 23, chapter 11, are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and listen to the language, often near death, he says. That's the same kind of language he's using here. He says, with 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, he says, and am I not weak? Which one of those is it? I have no idea. But my guess is that something in that list, or maybe some combination of those things in the list, is what Paul has in mind. But what is important to recognize is that he was suffering all of these things as a result of his ministry in the gospel. So what we do know, we know the location. We can have a decent guess at the nature of the affliction. But what we do know for certain is that this affliction, whatever it was very, very intense. It was very, very intense. Listen to the emotion of Paul's language in verses 8 and 9 here. He says that the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened, he says. He says that they were beyond our strength, that we despaired of life itself. Paul's describing himself as being so wearied and threatened by this affliction that he felt like he was someone who was about to collapse under a great burden. He felt as though he was completely out of strength. There was nothing left he could do. And he believed evidently that he was about to die. This word that is used here where it says we despaired of life, that word despaired, is a Greek word that has the idea that there was no path or exit that could be seen. You actually know an English word that this comes from, the word porous, which allows things to pass through it. If something is aporous, it is not porous, it does not allow things to pass through. That is the word that this is built on. So what Paul has found himself in, if this was a movie, he's turned a corner and he's now in an alley that has no exit. He's in a place where he's surrounded by the enemy, and there's no way of escape. This is how Paul feels in the midst of this affliction, whatever it was. He says there in verse 9, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. This is a serious situation, isn't it? Paul has no way out. He had his back against the wall. There was no exit. It was a desperate situation. You ever felt like that? You ever felt like you're in circumstances where there's no way out that you can see, at least? Well, Paul was there. So what does he do? Well, this brings us then to the next part of the passage I'd like us to consider. And Paul, as he's looking around and recognizing that there's no way out, he does what every Christian should do in those same kind of circumstances. He puts his dependence on God. He puts his dependence on God. It tells us there in the second part of verse 9 that in fact this situation was brought about so that he would rely on God, it says, and not on ourselves. This dependence on God manifested itself in 2 different ways, and I want to look at those this morning. The first of them is that he put his faith and hope exclusively in God. That is the key. Exclusively in God. This is not a situation where Paul's saying, well, I've got a plan and I hope God blesses it. It's a situation where he says, God, you're going to have to do this. This is you. You're going to have to come through. Notice the verse there, as he thinks himself with the sentence of death, he says, it was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. You see that act of faith that's involved in that language? He's saying that we're going to I'm in a death situation. The sentence of death has come down. And as I'm standing there facing this death situation, I'm going to put my faith in the one who raises the dead. You see the connection? I'm going to put my faith in God who can raise the dead. This is the kind of faith that we see in great saints in the Scriptures. Paul has it here. There's another man who exhibited this kind of faith. And I think he's a good illustration of what Paul's getting at. You remember a man named Abraham? Remember Abraham? He was a man who was promised a son. The son was going to come through Sarah. And this promised son was going to be a blessing to all the nations. He was going to build from this son a great nation. But then in Genesis chapter 22, God came to Abraham with a request that was unbelievable given what had been promised. He asked Abraham to take Isaac to a place that he would show him. And he was to take him up there and he was to offer Isaac. This is the promised son. He was to offer him as a sacrifice to the Lord. Well, Abraham, in faith, gathered up his things and started walking toward the place, ultimately Mount Moriah. And Isaac, of course, was starting to figure out that something wasn't quite right about this sacrifice. So they're climbing the hill to get up there. He's looking around, I see wood, I see everything we need, but I don't see a sacrifice. You remember Abraham. The Lord will provide that sacrifice. Of course, knowing that it was Isaac. And they walk up, and there's, you know the story. Isaac is on the altar, and Abraham raises his knife. And just before he kills his son, of course, the Lord stops him. But what's fascinating is to read the author of Hebrews' commentary on that episode. So here's Abraham. He knows this is the promised son. He knows he's been told to kill this son. Why does he go through with it? Listen to these words in Hebrews chapter 11. It tells us, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. How did you do it, Abraham? Verse 19. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. You see, Abraham's faith, the reason he was willing to do what he was about to do was because he believed in a God who could raise the dead. And so, though Abraham could not see a way out, Abraham could not see how this was going to unfold, he knew that he served a God who could raise the dead. Paul found himself in that same situation. When his back was against the wall, when there was no way out, when it looked like he was going to die, his faith was in the one who could raise the dead. He put his exclusive trust in someone who had power over life and death. You see, Paul was weak, but he served a God who was strong, strong enough to raise the dead. Well, the second way Paul's faith was manifested, or his dependence on God was manifested, we see in verse 11 of our text. And the way this was demonstrated is that he called on God's people to pray. He called on God's people to pray. So his back's against the wall. It seemed there was no way out. He had put his faith in God, and then he called on his fellow Christians to pray for him. Notice verse 11. You also, Paul says, must help us. You also must help us. How? By prayer. You also must help us by prayer so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessings granted us through the prayers of many. What is the blessing in the context? Is deliverance from this affliction. I want to think about prayer for just a moment and the importance of praying as Christians united. Why is it important for God's people to pray when they are in affliction? You say, well, we want deliverance. Well, yes. But why is it important that we pray together? Well, I think first of all, when we think about what is going on here, and the language Paul uses, is that prayer itself has a way of uniting God's people. It brings us together. It's obscured a little bit in the English translation, but this verb, you also must help us, has the idea of coming together or joining together in helping someone. So this isn't just, you must help us. It's, you must help us together. We're doing this together as partners in prayer. Prayer unites us together. This is especially important for Paul, who's dealing with a church that he has a strained relationship with. And he understands that one of the things that's going to heal that relationship is for them to pray together for him. It unites us. But prayer also, when it's done corporately and it's done with many people involved in it, it has a tendency to multiply thanksgiving. Did you catch that in the text there? He says, you also must help us by prayer so what's the purpose? So that many will give thanks. So that many will give thanks. You see, when Christians join together to pray, and when many Christians come together to pray, it increases the praise of God when that prayer request is answered. Let me illustrate it for you this way. Imagine you have a loved one who does not know the Lord. Say you have a son or a daughter and they're not a believer. And you really would like to see them come to the Lord. You could just pray for them, and you should. You could pray for them by yourself. And let's imagine, for instance, that they do, in fact, God answers that prayer, and that child comes to know the Lord. Well, you're going to rejoice and give thanks in answer to that prayer request, right? But it's only you who are going to be the one giving thanks. But imagine, say you have this child, son or daughter, and you would really like to see them come to know the Lord, and you enlist 5 or 6 of your friends to pray for your son or your daughter. Well, in that scenario, say the child comes to know the Lord, how many people will be giving thanks? It won't be just you. It's going to be your 5 or 6 friends along with you. And so the idea of it is that as more people pray, when that request is answered, more people are there to give thanks and praise to God for what He has done. You see how that works? This is why corporate prayer is so important. It brings people together and it multiplies praise to God. That is why we should pray together. Salem Baptist Church exists to glorify God. One of the ways we can do that is through prayer together, so that we can rejoice together when God answers those prayers. So this is Paul's dependence on God. It was manifested in exclusive trust on God and His power. And he called on God's people to pray. This brings us to the final part of the passage I would like us to consider, and that is God's deliverance for Paul. So here's Paul. He's put his faith in God. He's called on the Corinthians and other Christians to pray. Well, when it came down to it, did God come through? Did God come through? And the answer to that question is yes. God did come through. Notice verse 10. He, that is God, delivered us from such a deadly peril. And notice he expects that in the coming future, he will deliver us. Notice Paul's understanding of deliverance is both past and future in its look. God has delivered us, and when the time comes again, he will deliver us. Notice his faith grows. It says, the latter part of verse 10, on him we have set our hope. We have set our hope that he will deliver us again. So God came through. Now what would have happened though? I've got a quick moment to talk about this, I think. What would have happened if Paul had died? Does God always deliver in this life? Are there instances where people pray and they die? That does happen, doesn't it? What would Paul say to something like that? Would Paul have said, well, God didn't deliver? It's interesting how Paul talks about this. Take for a moment, turn your Bibles over to 2 Timothy chapter 4. I want to look at another passage where Paul once again has his back against the wall. 2 Timothy chapter 4. In this case, Paul's outcome is certain, and it is certain death, and he experiences that death. He is facing a Roman execution. 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning verse 6, he describes the situation. He says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. And at the time of my departure, the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Okay, this is the end. He's about to be executed for his faith. But skip down to verse 18 of this chapter. You know, we're talking about deliverance language, being rescued back in 2 Corinthians. Paul here is facing, in this case, death that he will not escape. But listen to the language that he uses in verse 18. He says there, the Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. You see what Paul is saying there, and what he's reaffirming, is the same thing that he was saying and reaffirming in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And that is the fact that God raises the dead. He knows that even if the Romans kill him, and they do kill him, that God will safely carry him into his kingdom. And that what awaits for him on Judgment Day is participation in the great resurrection of all the saints. And so even though Paul, in this case, loses out in this world, he says, no. God will rescue me. God delivered me, and he will deliver me. Because God always, ultimately, delivers his people. We left poor John Patton. What was to become of him? He sat there on that canoe, watching as the hordes of natives streamed toward him. In the meantime, he tells us, as we pick the story back up, they, that is the enemy, had gone to the mission house and broken in the door, and finding that we had escaped, they rushed on to Nowar's village. For as they began to plunder the bedroom, Nuka said, leave everything. Missy will come back for his valuable things at night, and then we will get them and him also. So he nailed up the door, and they all marched for Nowar's. We prayed. Notice the same response that Paul had. We prayed as one can only pray when in the jaws of death and on the brink of eternity. We felt that God was near and omnipotent to do what seemed best in His sight. When the savages were about 300 yards off, at the foot of a hill leading up to the village, Nowar touched my knee, saying, "Missy, Jehovah is hearing. They are all standing still." Had they come on, they would have met with no opposition, for the people were scattered in terror. On gazing shorewards and round the harbor, as far as we could see was a dense host of warriors. But all were standing still, and apparently absolute silence prevailed. We saw a messenger or herald running along the approaching multitude, delivering some tidings as he passed, and then disappearing in the bush. To our amazement, the host began to turn and slowly marched back in great silence and entered the remote bush at the head of the harbor. Nowar and his people were in ecstasies, crying out, "Jehovah has heard Missy's prayer. Jehovah has protected us and turned them away back." We were on that day, His trusting and defenseless children. Would you not, had you been one of our circle, have joined with us in praising the Lord God for deliverance from the jaws of death? I know not why they turned back, but I have no doubt it was the doing of God to save our lives. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word of comfort that we've just looked at. We thank you for the great power that you have, that you can raise the dead, and that there are no circumstances in this life that you cannot overcome. And Father, I ask that you would teach us to trust you. That even as times being a Christian in this world is hard, doing ministry can be hard, our faith is in someone who has the power over life and death. And I pray that you would encourage our hearts to put our faith in and trust into you, and to pray as your people, and that you would answer in such a way that we would be able to give thanks to you. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.